I think that being with you here tonight is not only a pleasure for me, but an honor. And I want to thank Galia and her wonderful team for inviting me, and also for putting together this really, amazing and essential conference. And I said essential because, as you know, this conference is dedicated to new thinking. And oh my gosh, is that urgently needed. Consider that here we are, 75 years after the Bretton Woods conference there, and our natural life support systems are threatened. Poverty is rampant, even here in this wealthy United States, where one-fifth of our children live in poverty. The gap between haves and have-nots is a chasm. On the stock markets, we have algorithms speculating like crazy. And all of this, despite the Bretton Woods goal of a more prosperous world and a saner and more peaceful world. And all of this is happening in the midst of a new technological revolution that, unlike the Industrial Revolution, which took centuries, this technological revolution is radically altering our economic and social and political landscape just about every day. And yet, our policies, the policies to presumably address all of this, are, they're not only proving ineffective, but actually, in many respects, harmful. And they're being made looking through a rear-view mirror, aren't they? Rather than looking at our present, much less at our future. So, I want to invite you in the short time we have together tonight to join me to do something new and exciting. To join me in looking at our society and our economy as they are now and as they can be through a new lens. A new lens that goes beyond the old thinking of conventional social and economic categories. That's a big order, but why do we need to do this? Well, look, linguistic psychologists have been telling us for a long time that the categories that are made available by a language, a society's language, channel our thinking, making it difficult, and sometimes for some people impossible, to see different possibilities. And as Einstein said, there he is, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. Which takes me straight to the present economic discourse, which, as you know, is to a large extent about capitalism versus socialism or vice versa. And I'm going to suggest to you that we need to get outside of that old paradigm we're stuck in if we are going to really solve our mounting social, economic, environmental problems. For starters, and I just want to give you a little bit of background, yes, both capitalism and socialism, they came out of the 1700s and the 1800s, early industrial times. So in our post-industrial knowledge service era, they would be antiquated on that count alone. But there's really much more, because neither capitalism nor socialism have prevented the despoilation of our natural environment, they've certainly have not brought a generally high good quality of life for all. Now, capitalism did bring a growing middle class, but at the same time, I don't have to tell you that it is destroying our environment. It's deeply widening the gap between those on top and those on bottom, leaving huge numbers of people in poverty. Going on to socialism, of course, it did alleviate dire poverty, didn't it? But think about the two large-scale applications of socialism in the former Soviet Union and in China, because they turned into repressive, violent systems where under Stalin and Mao, millions of people were killed, regimes with neither freedom nor equality, where those on top live much better than the mass of people. And as for, well, both created horrendous environmental problems, as we can still see today in China, where according to the World Health Organization, in 2016, in 1 year, over 1 million Chinese people died from the effects of ambient pollution. So both capitalist and socialist theories, however, were attempts to move to a more just economic system. I mean, Adam Smith, he challenged mercantilism, which was really controlled from the top by kings and court officials. And then Marx came along and he challenged, well, capitalism and the exploitation by so-called nobles and the burgeoning middle class of peasants and workers. But, and this is something really that we have to pay attention to, neither Smith nor Marx paid attention to our natural environment. For Smith, nature, what he saw really was unlimited economic growth, with nature just there to be exploited. And as for Marx, he saw unlimited industrial expansion, again with no thought to the damage caused to our life support systems. So for both of them, really, nature was just there to be exploited, period. As for the work of caring for people starting in childhood, for people's health, keeping a clean and healthy home environment, that too was not part of either of their economic equation. For them, these vital activities were just reproductive rather than productive work, even though they're essential if we're going to have any kind of a workforce. So really, this is something that we have to pay attention to, because you can't just tack on environmental harmony with nature to an imbalanced paradigm. And yes, theories are important. They're roadmaps, aren't they? So we do have to pay attention. And this view, now this is where things get a little bit more interesting, this view that did not assign economic value to the work of caring for people or keeping a clean and healthy home environment, which of course, if you think about it, carries over to the devaluation of caring for our natural environment. It came out of the value system of the times when both Smith and then Marx developed their theories. And then, as in many cultures to this day, that was just, quote, women's work, to be performed for free in male-controlled households. So it was basically invisible. And really, as late as the mid-19th century, when Marx wrote about socialism, and even later, to this day, this work is just considered, quote, women's work. And in many places, as I said, this women's work in both homes and the market was at that time legally the property of their husbands or their fathers. So, and here's where my legal background sort of helps a little bit. I found out that as late as when Marx wrote, in many jurisdictions, in most jurisdictions, if a woman was injured, she could not sue for her injuries herself. Only her husband could for, quote, loss of her services. So you can see why this work just didn't become part of the economic paradigm. And unfortunately, we've inherited this. This devaluation of care work, caring for people, starting in early childhood, caring for our Mother Earth, is still the focus of economics. It is excluded in the focus of economics, which, as you probably know, really focuses on a very limited economic map. The market economy, the government economy, to some extent, the illegal economy, but the three life-sustaining sectors and their economic contributions are ignored. So what we really need, for starters, is a new economic map that includes them, as you can see. And I want to say to you that this is essential not only for human and environmental reasons, but for purely economic reasons. Because consider, in our knowledge service era, as economists somehow never tire of telling us, the most important capital is what they like to call high-quality human capital. Well, we know from both psychology and neuroscience that whether this, quote, high-quality human capital of resilient, flexible people able to learn, to work with others, to quickly adapt to new circumstances, including new technologies, whether this is produced or not, really hinges to a very large extent on the care and education children receive early on. So we're back to this work that has been excluded from the conventional economic paradigm that is still taught in our universities and that is still central to the popular and to a large extent the scholarly discourse. And what we come to here, as I said, it gets more interesting because this is really a systems analysis, is the fact that, look, economic and social systems are inextricably interconnected. So economics, don't just spring up like Athena was supposedly sprang out whole from Zeus's head, right? In isolation. They are embedded, like other institutions, family, education, religion, politics, in the larger social context. So the exclusion from economics of the value of caring and caregiving work in the three life-sustaining economic sectors of the household, the community, and natural economy was the result of the social context out of which both capitalist and socialist theory arose in the 1700s and 1800s. However, once you look at social contexts in terms of our conventional social categories, you can't explain this, can you? And also, looking at them through these old lenses doesn't help us move forward. So here we again come to what I started with, the need for new language that goes beyond the very familiar old social categories like right versus left, religious versus secular, Eastern versus Western, Northern versus Southern, and so forth. You know, first of all, if you really think about it, societies in every one of these categories have been violent and repressive. Whether it was Hitler's Nazi Germany, a rightist Western society, or Stalin's former Soviet Union, a leftist Western society, whether it's Kim Jong-un in Korea in the East, whether it's religious societies like ISIS, the Taliban, etc., or the would-be regime of religious fundamentalists in the West today. Because look, societies in every one of these categories really only look at one or another aspect of society, as you can see. I mean, are they secular or religious? Where are they located? What kind of economic system do they have? Which, by the way, is why one of my colleagues calls them weapons of mass distraction, because they fragment our consciousness. And even more critically, if you really think about these categories, and I urge you to do that, you see that every one of them pays scant, if any, attention to the majority of humanity, women and children. And obviously, if we only look at part of a picture, well, the obvious is you can't see the whole picture, can you? And so the problem is that this really goes against every principle of what we hear so much about today, systems thinking, systems literacy. And this is why the method developed in my research over the years, the study of relational dynamics, takes into account a much larger database, a database that includes the whole of humanity, both its female and male halves, the whole of our lives, not only as conventional categories do, politics and economics as conventionally defined, but where we all live, in our family and other intimate relations. And yes, as those of you familiar with my book, The Chalice and the Blade, know, which, by the way, is now in its 57th printing in the US.
Wow.
Thank you. But it also takes into account the whole of our history, including that long span of millennia that we call prehistory. What happens when you look at this larger database, you can see configurations that keep repeating themselves cross-culturally and historically. The partnership system and the domination system. And what we see is that despite all their differences, the repressive and violent societies I just mentioned are based on top-down rankings of domination. Man over man, man over woman, religion over religion, race over race, sexual orientation over sexual orientation, and so forth. And a striking thing, and this is really important, is that in these societies, these rankings, which are of course ultimately backed up by fear or by force, they're not only present in economic and political relations, but also in family, in childdom, and in gender relations. And all these, of course, are interconnected. So very, very briefly, I want to give you the configuration of the core configuration of the domination system. First, as you see, the family, economic, and social structure has rigid hierarchies of domination. And I really want to emphasize that this is also in the family, because that is really important. Second, they rank male over female, and they have rigid gender stereotypes, so that anything that's considered masculine, such as domination and violence, is deemed more valuable than anything considered feminine, such as caring, caregiving, and nonviolence. Third, they have a high degree of violence and abuse, from child and wife beating to pogroms, to lynchings, chronic wars. And fourth, their beliefs and stories. And we humans live by stories, and we've got to change the story. This is what we're doing here, isn't it? Changing the story. Their stories make all of this seem normal, moral, either biologically or divinely ordained. By contrast, the partnership configuration, it has a very different structure. It's always a matter of degree. No society is a pure partnership or domination systems. I mean, you can see, for example, these examples in cultures as varied as the La Paz Zapotec of Mexico, the Minangkabau of Sumatra, where there really is a very high value of caring for both children and nature. They get it. And we also see it, and I'll return to that, in some European nations, particularly Sweden, Finland, Norway, where there is a generally good standard of living for all. First, they have a more democratic structure in families, economics, and the state of tribe. And they do have hierarchies. But I had to coin new words again. Because, I mean, we need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, we need leaders. But there's a big difference between hierarchies of actualization and hierarchies of domination. In hierarchies of actualization, people are empowered rather than disempowered. And yes, responsibility, respect, accountability doesn't just flow from the bottom up. It flows both ways. This is something that we hear a lot about today. Also, of course, they have a much more democratic structure in gender relations. They have fluid gender roles, equitable gender relations, so that traits and activities, and this is where you see systems dynamics that are considered soft, feminine in domination systems, are highly valued in women, in men, and in social and economic policy. And this is really very important, and I'll get back to it. But third, they do not have a high degree of violence and abuse because they're not needed to maintain these rigid rankings of domination. And as for their belief system, they recognize the obvious cruelty, violence are human possibilities, but their beliefs and stories deem caring, mutual respect, and really benefit and caring normal, natural, biological, etc. So you can see right away that contrary to conventional social categories, and I really want to emphasize this, such as right versus left, religious versus secular, Eastern versus Western, Northern versus Southern, and so forth, the categories of the partnership and domination system do not ignore or marginalize how a society constructs childhood and gender roles and relations. They recognize what we know from both psychology and neuroscience, that what children experience and observe early on impacts nothing less than how our brains develop, and hence how people think, feel, and act, including how they vote and work. Indeed, it is largely, and this is really something important for us to recognize, that it's largely through childhood and gender roles and relations that children first learn what is considered normal, moral, inevitable, which explains why, for Hitler's rightist or Stalin's leftist, or for Eastern or Western religious fundamentalist leaders, a top priority is preserving or returning to a so-called traditional family, which is code. It's code for an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. Why? Because look, it is here that children learn before their brains, much less their critical faculties, are fully developed, that one kind of human is more valuable than another kind of human, as in the ranking of male over female. And they also learn another lesson, which is essential for domination systems, that it is very painful not to obey orders, no matter how arbitrary or unjust. Yet for many people, and this includes even many highly educated people who consider themselves progressives, these are just women's and children's issues. And you know, really we shouldn't be surprised about this, because consider that most of what we have been taught as important knowledge and truth marginalizes or does not even include women and children, the majority of humanity. I mean, think about it. So how could we see the connection between the status of women and children on the one hand and the society's politics, economics, and general quality of life on the other? And this continues to this day, even though there are empirical studies that show these connections. Way back already in 1995, the Center for Partnership Studies did a study, a statistical study using data from 89 nations, showing that the status of women is a powerful predictor of general quality of life. And you know, since then, the World Value Surveys, which look at values in nations representing 80% of the world's people, as well as the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap reports, have verified this, and not only in terms of economics, but in terms of democracy, human rights, and environmental protection. Well, one obvious reason is women are half of the population. So if women are discriminated against in the workplace and in the home, for example, in a number of developing nations, girls are not only given less education, they're given less health care and even less food. Well, obviously, this has a huge impact. You know, the ones that survive, we know that malnourished mothers give birth to children who are not developed properly. I mean, it has enormous implications. And this is something that we really also need to pay attention to, by the way, which is that globally the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor are women and children. So if we're serious about finding solutions to poverty, we have to look at this invisible majority. But, you know, the reason for these connections, and this is where we come back to the systems dynamics, which is really what this work is about. The systems dynamics of domination systems and partnership systems and their effect on what is or is not economically valued. And as you glimpsed in the in relationship to the cultural roots of capitalism and socialism, domination systems have a gendered system of values. That's right. We don't think of it that way, but that's what it is, in which anything considered soft or feminine, like caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is devalued. And I have a mosquito who's come to visit. All right? So consider that somehow there is always money, isn't there, for prisons. And what is that? The stereotype, the dominator stereotype of the punitive male head of household, right? And there's always money for weapons, for wars. What is that? That is, again, a masculine, so-called masculine stereotype in domination system, the violent hero. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for children, for people's health, for keeping a clean and healthy environment, for the so-called soft or feminine. And this evaluation, obviously, and I want to repeat this, yes, it has a very bad effect on general quality of life, but economically, in our post-industrial age, this is potentially disastrous because of what I mentioned earlier, and it really bears repeating when economists tell us that the most important capital is this high-quality human capital. For goodness sakes, let's keep in mind what neuroscience, hard science shows, that whether people's capacities are or are not developed largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive. So investment in caring for and educating people is the best investment a nation can make. So what I've really been talking to you about is a very simple equation that as long as values considered soft or feminine are discounted and undervalued, we really cannot realistically expect policies that support the work of caring for people and for nature. So we're talking about a paradigm shift, aren't we? And pardon the word, paradigm has been sort of ground into the ground, but that's exactly, it's a worldview shift. And I want to again say none of this is taught in our schools and universities, despite findings from neuroscience, which, by the way, are detailed in the new book that Galia has kindly bought as a birthday present for me, for all of you, which just came out with Oxford. Yeah, it just came out with Oxford University Press this month. So you've got it hot off the press. Again, that of the lifelong impact of childhood experiences, child development is still marginalized in our siloed universities. If it's taught at all, it's only taught in relation to the family. It should be taught in relation to sociology, to political science, to economics, so that we can connect the dots. And there's another thing. Think about it. Out of over 600 years of so-called humanities or modern science, which, as the historian of science David Noble noted, really came out of a clerical, monastic, medieval, generally misogynistic, what he calls world without women. Out of these over 600 years, only 50 years ago did gender studies, women's studies first and then men's and gender studies, even enter the university. And then it is still, as you well know, completely marginalized. So it's really a lot that we have to change, but it's not that complicated. Once you start thinking, doing systems thinking, and use new social categories, and also new studies that make it possible to see connections that are invisible through the lenses of the old studies and the old categories, then you have a roadmap to go forward. So I want to now move to 4 steps that we can take, because I'm a visionary, but I'm a very practical visionary, and I think that you need to know what are the most important intervention points. Okay, so the first step is recognizing that our old economic systems of both capitalism and socialism came out of more rigid domination-oriented times, and that we need a new economics that goes beyond them. Now, this does not mean that we should, so to speak, throw out the baby with the bathwater, okay? We certainly want a strong free market. We don't happen to have one. I mean, but it would be nice to have one. That would be a partnership element, right, of capitalism. And we certainly want enlightened government policies, and I have nothing to say about that for the moment. But we, in other words, we want to retain and strengthen the partnership elements of both capitalism and socialism, but really, we have to go further. We're in the post-industrial knowledge service era, if only for that reason, to really recognize that the real wealth of a nation, of the world, is not financial. And you see this every day, don't you? The stock market seesaws up, down, up, down. The real wealth, our real wealth, consists of the contributions of people and of nature. So we need what we have not had: economic metrics, and I'll get to that, rules, practices, policies that accord value and reward the most essential human work of caring for people starting in childhood and caring for our Mother Earth. In my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, which Galia mentioned, I have called sort of the outline that I provide for moving to this system partnerism or caring economics, knowing full well that to some people, just calling something caring is going to immediately trigger this response that it is soft, it's feminine, it's not effective, and I'll get to that in a minute. But you know, this revolution that we're seeing in gender roles and more flexible, more fluid gender roles, we're today hearing from prominent male corporate leaders about caring policies and caring practices, aren't we? Because they recognize, what I'll get to in a minute, that they are effective. But I really want to make a point here. As long as we think that it's capitalism versus socialism or socialism versus capitalism, we can't recognize that what we're really struggling to leave behind is domination economics. Domination economics. And another mosquito. Boy, they really are friendly. What do I mean by that? It can be ancient or modern, can be Eastern, like the old Chinese empire, the Indian caste system, Middle Eastern chieftains, or it can be Western, like feudal or mercantile times. We're talking about domination economics with today's mega corporations really being the new fiefdoms on a much larger global scale. And you know, from this perspective, it's really interesting because we then can see what so-called neoliberalism and that so-called trickle-down economics is all about. I mean, think about it. Isn't it really a continuation of traditions of domination where those on the bottom are supposed to content themselves with the scraps dropping, you know, as in the Hollywood movies you've seen, from the opulent tables of those on top. It is pure domination economics. So that takes me to the second step, which is very important, recognizing that, as I said, economic and social systems are inextricably interconnected. And very specifically, the difference is whether they orient to the domination or partnership side of the social scale, with each system's very different set of values influencing economics. Now, the good news, because I do want to give you some good news, and there's lots of good news actually, but I will focus on the fact that we really don't have to start from scratch. If you look at modern history through the new lens of the partnership domination continuum, because, as I said, it's always a matter of degree, you see that over the last centuries, at least in some world regions, we have been moving towards the partnership side again. And I say again because the evidence is huge now that for the vast majority of the millennia of human societies, our original course was in a partnership rather than domination direction. And stories, because you remember selfish genes, original sin? I mean, we've been brainwashed, haven't we? So it's time that we really look at the evidence, and that is summarized in many books, including some of mine. But consider all the progressive social movements of modern times have challenged one thing: traditions of domination. Back in the Enlightenment, what was really challenged? The so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule over their, quote, subjects, right? And then, of course, the feminist movement challenged, again, the supposedly divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in the so-called castles of their homes. And the abolitionists and the civil rights and anti-colonial movements, what did they challenge? Another so-called divinely ordained domination tradition, the right of a so-called superior race to rule over a so-called inferior one. If you look at the movements for social and economic justice, they were challenging top-down economic control. If you look at the peace movement and the more recent movement really challenging the pandemic of violence against women and children in intimate relations worldwide, which we must pay attention to, they're challenging, again, the use or the force or the threat of force to impose one's will on another, all the way to the environmental movement challenging our once hallowed conquest of nature, right? Which is at our level of technological development with our overpopulation, largely due to the subordination of women, but that's another lecture. But something for us to keep in mind. It's challenging something that is about to do us in. But these movements, and really this is very important, they focus primarily on dismantling the top of the domination pyramid. Politics and economics is conventionally defined. They have left the foundations, foundational parent-child, gender, family relations, on the domination side, and it is on those foundations that regression after regression keeps rebuilding the domination system, as we're seeing today in our nation. If you really analyze what happened in the election of Mr. Trump, it was this ranking, wasn't it? This idea of in-group versus out-group thinking learned early in childhood, which is, again, why we need to leave behind the old ways of thinking if we're going to stop these regressions. And that takes me to the third step, to moving to a caring economics of partnerism, and that is debunking the old assumption that caring policies and practices are not economically effective, because study after study shows that they are. For example, studies show that the companies that regularly appear in the Fortune 500 or Working Mothers as the best companies to work for, companies that have caring policies, they have a higher return to investors. You know, this is just that simple. And not only do businesses have a high ROI, return on investment, from caring policies, so also do nations. And I really want to tell you about that, because if we use this new lens, we can clearly see that. We see it in nations that at the beginning of the 20th century were so poor, they had famines. You know, Minnesota got populated by people fleeing, right? Famines. Today, these nations are regularly in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Reports. And a major factor in this dramatic change is that they pioneered caring policies like high-quality child care, universal health care, generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers, by the way, elder care with dignity. In other words, while these are not ideal societies, they have a generally good living standard for all, low poverty and crime rates, high longevity rates. They're also ahead in the use of solar energy and other clean power sources. So they show the enormous return of investment in caring for our most important assets, people and nature. But, and this is where I want to take you back for a minute to looking at what happened there. Through this new lens, because this is why we need these new social categories. It did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because these are the nations that have moved closest to the partnership side of the partnership domination continuum of any so-called developed nations. First, in contrast to domination systems of authoritarian rule in both the family and the state, they have more democracy and equality in both the family and the state. Second, in contrast to domination systems where rigid rankings are ultimately backed up by fear and force, they have been in the forefront of trying to leave behind traditions of domination. Think about it. First peace studies came out of these nations. The first laws saying that using physical discipline against children in families is against the law. They have a strong men's movement to disentangle, quote, masculinity from its domination equation with domination and violence. Third, rather than, well, the rigid ranking of male over female of domination systems, they have a much more equal partnership between women and men in both the family and the state, so that about 40 to 50% of national legislators are female. And this is where we come back to the dynamics that we have to really understand if we are to really successfully make change. Because as the status of women rises, men no longer find it such a threat to their masculinity, right, which gives them status in domination systems, to also embrace more stereotypically feminine traits, activities, and policies. So men too vote for these caring policies. And, you know, I want to say that these are not socialist nations. They have a very healthy market economy. They very often call themselves caring societies. And I want to make one more point about them. Contrary to what we're sometimes told, this happened not because these are relatively small and homogeneous societies, because think about it, there are other relatively small homogeneous societies that are very domination-oriented and have hardly embraced caring values. This is why we need new categories. Now, that takes me to the fourth and final step I'm going to cover with you today. And this is that we must change how we measure economic health. Just think about GDP, which of course, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic, because GDP really includes activities that actually harm and take life as productive work. And I'm not just it's not just making the cigarettes, but the resulting medical bills, the resulting funeral bills, they're all great for GDP, aren't they? Same with fast foods, with high fructose, same with oil spills, the cleanup costs. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. But not only does GDP include negatives as positives, it fails to include the huge economic value of the essential activities of the three economic sectors ignored in present thinking: the natural economy, the community volunteer economy, and the household economy, the three life-sustaining sectors that I propose in the real wealth of nations must be included in our economic paradigm to meet our unprecedented challenges. Now, some people will say, well, wait a minute, you can't quantify this. Well, of course you can't quantify the value of caring, but you can certainly quantify its economic value. And that has been done. For instance, a recent Australian report found that if the unpaid caring work performed in households were included, it would constitute 50% of the reported GDP. Think about that for a minute. I mean, that is huge, and yet it has been invisible. It's not taught in our schools, it's not in most economic treatises, and it's up to us, to you, to change that so that the thousands of economists who graduate every year have a more complete model of where economic activity is taking place and where it is most productive over time. And this problem of metrics is why the Center for Partnership Studies developed social wealth economic indicators, or SWAYs. Now, these indicators differ from not only from GDP, but from most GDP alternatives in that they are geared to our knowledge service age, showing that the most effective approach to developing human capacity, that high-quality human capital, I don't like the term, I prefer the term of human capacity, that the most effective way is supporting care and education in early childhood and throughout life, and that a healthy natural environment is key to human not only survival, but to us thriving. And I should also add that social wealth economic indicators are different from other GDP alternatives, which just give us a snapshot of what is in terms of quality of life. They not only look at outputs, but also at the inputs that make for better outputs. And once you do that, you begin to see, well, for example, SWAYs show that it is not coincidental that the United States invests less than half of what other OECD nations do in family-friendly policies, less than half, and that it has the highest infant mortality, maternal mortality, and child poverty rates of OECD nations. We've got to really provide this missing information to policymakers and to all of us to make sound economic decisions. Now, I can tell you more about SWAYs, which, of course, unlike GDP and GDP alternatives, they do pay attention to childhood and to gender. But I'm not going to, because you can find out more about it at centerforpartnership.org. And also, we're going to have a continuation of our session on these indicators, and you're all welcome to come. So I just want to close by inviting you to join with me in block by block, building a new economic system that can meet the challenges we face. A system that, as Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote about the real wealth of nations, provides a template, and I quote, a template for the better world we have been urgently seeking, or as acclaimed author Charles Eisenstein, who's here with us tonight, calls it, quote, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Economic systems are human creations. We can create an economic system, economic rules, metrics, policies that support caring for ourselves, others, and our Mother Earth. So let's do it for ourselves, for our children, and generations to come. Thank you.